Thanks a lot for coming. Welcome. It's great to see a number of bodies showing up in person and to know that there's folks attending online. I see the numbers are going up. This is the first of this year's graduate booster series, which are intended, as the metaphor was originally intended, to be like rocket boosters, giving you a little bit of propulsion and momentum in using and becoming familiar with some library services and technologies that can help you, particularly in your research, literature searching, manipulating results, saving things, archiving them, and all those sorts of stuff. So the idea is, for us, is that your time is very valuable, and you don't always know when you attend a session whether what you're going to be attending is exactly what you're looking for. And so we decided to keep them to 15 minutes. You get a little bit of a taste. You can decide for yourself from there whether you want to go on and contact the people responsible for helping you in those areas or explore some of the resources and links that we'll be providing. So I'm Marc Bragdon, the head of the Research Commons. So the Research Commons is the third floor of the Harriet Irving Library, and the people and services attached to it, which, as the name implies, are intended to bolster your efforts at conducting, processing, disseminating research. So part of it too is that you get a chance to put a face to some of the expertise and services available to you, so we're not so unfamiliar. So starting things off is going to be my colleague, Mike Nason. Mike is a multi-instrumentalist, equal parts open access evangelist and avenger. And most recently awarded Best UNB Presenter for the week of August 18th. Auspicious beginning of the year. Here we are moving into early fall, and Mike is going to be talking about scholar profiles.
My name is Mike Nason. I'm the Open Scholarship and Publishing Librarian here. We're going to talk a little bit about scholar profiles and sharing your work. I obviously can't see people online, but just a show of hands, how many of you are grad students? Everybody? And is anybody doing their PhD right now? Great, cool. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about publishing and some stuff you need to know sort of leading into the conversation around scholar profiles. This is the sort of a broad view of what's referred to as a research life cycle. A standard research life cycle sort of starts, way over here in the ideas section, and you plan your work, you do research concepts, you have maybe a number of drafts, things you're working on, and then eventually you get to the experiment, you're collecting data, you're collecting that data, storing it in a place, you're doing maybe grant management if you're getting grant money, this kind of stuff. You come to your conclusions, you draft the paper, you move on to the publication cycle. You submit your work to a place, it gets peer reviewed. A couple versions come out of the peer review process, it gets published. People read your work, then they have ideas, and back on we go. Sort of a general look at what you do in that list. So read works, get inspired, plan, experiment, draft work, peer review, publish and present your work, preserve and disseminate that work, repeat. And you'll note I've got impact measures and prestige, which is a thing I don't really believe in, but we'll get to it. When you were an undergraduate, this is basically all you used to do. You read a publication, you got an idea related to it, you wrote it, and then you moved on with your life. So you just never thought about that work again. Some of you who are on your PhD probably thought about your thesis this way. I know I sure did. So you don't really have to engage with that work in a real way. But increasingly, what you're going to want to do is think about what happens to your work after you're done with it. Who gets to see it? Who has access to it? Where do I share it? What am I allowed to share? And these kinds of questions. It's not just about cranking them out and walking away anymore. So at each one of these steps that we kind of talked about before, you're going to have a variety of data outputs or outputs in general that you may want to share with people. So your research data, as you collect it, do you want to share your research data in an open access repository so that people can see your research data? Do you want to share that when you publish, or do you want to share it before you publish? When do you want to make the decision about when to share your research data? Similarly, as you kind of get moving along and you're going through your conclusions and you're writing a draft work, maybe do I want to share my draft work in a preprint server? It's like not something I've submitted to a journal yet, but I'm about to submit it to a journal. This is the preprint. Do I want to share that maybe with my community of practice? Depending on the discipline you're in, maybe yes. Depending on the discipline you're in, it may be inappropriate. It's kind of hard to say, depending on what you study, but you can share that preprint out before you publish it, and most of the time you can just kind of do that in a preprint server of your choice, and I'll talk about some in a bit. Or then when you publish and you're like, well, okay, I know my article's been accepted, so now do I share my accepted manuscript, the thing that's about to be published? Am I allowed to share that version of a work? Do I share the published version? Can I share the published version? And like, hot tip, when you go to publish, most of the time they ask you to sign over copyright, so you don't really get to decide where that stuff goes because it's now theirs, it's not yours. So you have to make a lot of decisions sort of through this process about where you want to put your work and what you're up to. And then, you know, when you disseminate it and all the other places, do I want to put it in a bunch of repositories? Do I want to put it in one place? Do I want to share it on a website? Do I want to put it on a profile? Where do I share my work? Who can see my work? Get those sweet metrics. Odds are good that you're going to want to share some of these things with folks. It's really important, I would think. And I think the entire point of scholarship is for at least some people to see your work and for your work to make some kind of a difference. You're not really, you know, in academia to just kind of hoard all of your stuff and like hatch evil plans or whatever. Like you want to share that work with people, I think, ideally. I guess unless you're, you know, like a chemical engineer or something. That's a joke about capitalism. So the whole point of scholarship for, you know, for ideally as many people as possible to see your work and for your work to make some kind of difference. That's good, right? It's public good for people to have access to your work, no matter what, I think, I hope. So when you think about this thing and you think about impact measures and prestige, the more people can find your work, the higher that impact will be. The more eyes on your work, the better. Always. That's always good. You don't want to limit access to your work. There's no prestige and people can't afford my stuff. That's not a thing. you want people to find and see your research. So sharing your work, obviously this is a big question. How do I share my work? How do I make my work accessible to people? And, you know, assuming you're looking to enter this career as an academic, either short-term or long-term, you're going to have to share it. Publishing is a kind of sharing. It's inevitable. You don't like, it would be really frowned upon for you to spend an entire career working in a room, not publishing anything, and then walking out with boxes of all the stuff you studied. Like that's not how it works. You've got to generate this research as you go. So there are a few different ways that people can share their work, and I'm going to talk about these three things sort of uniquely: social networking, communities of practice, and scholarly profiles. So social networking is obvious, I believe, to a lot of people. Facebook, Twitter, and I put Mastodon here. You know, your mileage may vary. You know, it's very possible for social networking to have a positive impact on the way you share your research. I follow lots of researchers who tweet out DOIs for the articles they publish to the people that they work with most frequently, and people go, oh, look, a new article, I'll go check that out. And it never hurts to share your work in these ways. Twitter is like in a lot of ways, and Facebook probably significantly more so, sort of a pit of despair. Like, you know, it's not like a good place to be, but you can find communities that work in the same places as you and make sort of communities of practice within these social media platforms. So, you know, useful, I think, for sharing your work, keeping up with announcements, that kind of thing. Also, social networking. LinkedIn is maybe the bleakest form of social networking. And then ResearchGate and academia.edu. I'm going to also identify these are academic social networks. A lot of people think of ResearchGate as a place to share your publications. It's a for-profit website the way Facebook is. It's free, but they're harvesting all of the data about how you use it, who you share it with, who your connections are, the same way Facebook does. It is just as problematic as Facebook is. So if you're a begrudging user of Facebook or Twitter or whatever else, this is kind of the same deal. It just has that academic flavor. Their service is specific to academics. That doesn't mean it's bad. You know, if you have a community of practice in any of these places, people you work with or want to follow, you know, the tool is what you make it. I do want to highlight too, academia.edu has the .edu designation, but they bought that before legislation that said that EDU legislation had to be an academic institution. So they were grandfathered in. So it's not actually academic, even though they have the .edu. They kind of beat them to the punch on that URL acquisition. So these are all for-profit organizations. So community practice, you've heard me mention that a couple times before. That's sort of like the other people that research in your field. So you may know, even within your own departments, a couple people that study stuff that's kind of like the stuff you study. And you sort of share that information with each other. You know, I did my master's in history and there were very few people studying the thing I was studying. So my community of practice there was small and I would have had to go elsewhere to find it. But your community of practice are other people who work in the same field in which you work. So as a librarian who does open scholarship, I have a handful of communities of practice related around publishing and, you know, this kind of thing. So it's kind of the place where you find yourself communicating with other scholars in your field. Communities of practice, again, you can find Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon, easy, no problem. And you can find them similarly in LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and academia.edu. Those are all places where you can find a community of practice to share your work. But there are also places like Slack and Discord, places you end up where you're communicating with people maybe more casually about research, or not in a very public forum, but instead in a more exclusive and specific one. And then there's also places like preprint servers, like bioRxiv or archive, where you can find people who are working on the same sorts of research as you, who are sharing their research on like a preprint server and working on that stuff directly. Scholarly profiles. Why you're all here, I guess. Well, that's a presumption that you're here to hear me. Total afterthought. Scholarly profiles differ a little bit from either of these places in that the whole point is sharing the output academically directly. It's like a CV on the internet. You're trying to make a very clear indication. This is a representation of me as a scholar and my work. They're unique and that they very specifically represent your work as an academic professional. So you're not going to like log into a scholarly profile and put like, what are you thinking today? And then you like put a little status update. Like that doesn't really exist in this space. It's really just about sharing this stuff. They're kind of not unlike a CV. So publications, funding, degrees, projects, credentials, employment, contact info, very straightforward. They're kind of like an academic Tinder in a bit of a way, but instead of being about a hookup, it's about your research career. What you want to do is indicate to people the things you're about, the things you research, the work you're doing, and share that stuff with others. I would say a note here that the odds of seeing photos of men holding up a freshly caught fish are about equivalent. So if you've seen that on Tinder, you're going to see that in these places. They're always like biologists. They love to hold up fish. So these are kind of the biggies that people typically refer to in this space. There's a Scopus ID. Scopus, if you publish you'll know if you've read a lot of stuff that's in Scopus, whether or not you want a Scopus ID. If that's the place you're publishing, it'll make a lot of sense. It'll track all of your journal publications that exist in Scopus. Google Scholar, similar, does this thing where you can kind of index all of your publications in Google Scholar, but it sort of presumes that your publications are already indexed by Google Scholar. People mention this a lot, but the problem with Google Scholar is that it is like, people kind of have to jump through some extra hoops to make sure the work even ends up in that place. But Google Scholar is another very popular one. The service is free. So, as long as Google is properly scraping the websites, the stuff that you work with, your work will appear there. And they do some cursory metrics for things like H-index and that kind of stuff. But I'd caution that like they're a very small team. Like people think of Google as enormous. It's like 5 people. Like it's really not many people who work at Google Scholar because Google Scholar doesn't make money. So like all things Google, their longevity is potentially questionable. That it still exists is kind of mind-blowing to me. And I do wish for a day when it completely evaporates. Work?
Go after the presentation.
Let's do after. Orchid, to me, is the big one. I highly recommend you get an Orchid account. They are free. Orchid is a not-for-profit service that provides you with a unique identifier for yourself as a human. This is great because names are kind of a bad way to track your work. Names change for a number of reasons. Someone transitions, they get buried, they move to a place and they want to accommodate people who can't pronounce a name because they're super Anglo and they don't want to try. There are all of these other reasons why your name changes throughout your publication history, but that ID stays the same always. And that ID is attached to the publications you make so that people can click on that ID and get taken back to your publications that live in your Orchid profile. So it's if you've ever used and I'm sure you guys see this all the time in your citations, like DOIs to articles. This is basically a DOI for people. This is how you locate you as a researcher. Orchid takes that ID and it allows you to use it when you publish. So when I publish in a place and I have an Orchid ID and it's connected to say Crossref, it's metadata and it automatically ends up in my publication list and I don't have to add things to lists. It's all very easy and straightforward. What's nice about Orchid is, again, international, not-for-profit, very transparent, open governance, hugely trustworthy. In some countries, like in the States, if I applied for NSF funding, having an Orchid profile is a requirement. It's how they take my publications in. In the long run, we'll see stuff like Canada CCV and other places start to accept this metadata more broadly, but especially early career, good idea to adopt this now. And worst case scenario, you can pull your publications out if it folds and put them in another place because you'll have all the metadata, but highly recommended. Orchid is really great. It's not super feature rich. It doesn't do metrics. It doesn't do all this other stuff, but it's a really great place to put your research where you're in control of that thing. So highly recommended to use ORCID. Just a really quick word on persistent identifiers. They're kind of everywhere, and an ORCID is a persistent identifier. The DOI you get when you publish an article is a PID. Even UNB has its own identifier. There's a thing called ROR for institutions. And a lot of this stuff is connected by what's referred to as open scholarly infrastructure. So like metadata is typically free, and this stuff kind of gets pushed between systems. So your ORCID is one of the pieces of this sort of like open infrastructure that says like, we'll match this ORCID ID to this institution and to these publications, and then you can kind of start to pull together a view of the scholarly record, kind of like automagically. I'm going to use that phrase, it's loaded. It's not really magic, but automagically. So if you have an ORCID, that's a good call. It's amazing, as long as you're not like super negligent with metadata. So once you picked a place to put your work, you actually have to share it. More than anything, you need to remember that your work belongs to you. Usually when you publish, you no longer own your work. Usually the publisher does. This is so true that a lot of researchers don't even know that they're doing it, and they're surprised to find out they've been doing it. I think if you talked to probably 75% of your profs and they said, here's a paper I wrote, and you said, do you own that? They would say, yes. I mean, they don't. They absolutely don't. Most of the time they don't. So make sure you check things like publisher policies when you publish to see what you're signing away, what you're allowed to share. As early career academics, you may feel kind of stressed out saying, I'd like to keep my copyright. And you don't necessarily have to fight that battle. I'm haranguing the people who brought you through the system to get them to do it so they can take the hit. But just know that you have some autonomy here, and you can push back a little bit. Make sure you check to see what you're actually allowed by publishers to share. Can I share preprints? Can I share other things? There's a link to a service here called Sherpa Romeo where you can look up any journal and find out what things you're allowed to share and in what places. Think about what you want to share and where is best to share it. Where can I put this in a place where the people who need to see it will be able to see it? If you're working in public health research and practitioners can't see your research, that sucks. Like, find ways to get your research in front of the people who need to see it. And I think that's it. I have questions here.
Yeah, I'm having a question regarding, this kind of website, ORCID, Scopus. We have to pay.
ORCID is always free to everybody.
And about Scopus?
I think Scopus is free, but if you don't have access to Scopus publications, like if you're not an academic in a place that has the subscriptions to the things you want, I would think that some of that functionality may be limited. But ORCID's 100% free. I think like Scopus is owned by Elsevier, who are like an oligopoly and like incredibly powerful and super rich and big time for profit. And ORCID is a not-for-profit organization. So yeah, ORCID's super free, but you can connect the two. So if for whatever reason you go to make a Scopus ID and you're working at an institution, you can just connect your Scopus ID to your ORCID and it'll push all your publications over. And then if you end up working at a place that doesn't, you can't use Scopus ID the same way, everything will be in ORCID and you can just kind of move on. It's the safer bet of the two.
At the time, my correspondence author provide his ORCID ID, but now that time I didn't provide it. But now I have my ORCID ID. Can I add that publication? How can I add that?
Actually, that's a great question. You can go to your ORCID publication list, and there's like a list of works, and you'll click on Add Works. And if you have the DOI for the articles in which you published, you can go by DOI, slap the DOI in, and hit Go, and it'll just pull it right into your publication list. So on an ORCID account, you can put all of the preferred names or names in which you published. And any name changes. You don't lock yourself into a name. That's kind of the beauty of ORCID. The ORCID account stays the same. So, you can make an ORCID account now with the name you had, and then change your preferred name in your ORCID profile to match what you're publishing under, but have the other names in which you publish listed on the profile.
Okay, one of my other responsibilities on campus is as the librarian for the Faculty of Education, and I know there's a few Masters of Education students either in the room or who have signed up virtually for that. So I'm going to be speaking about Zotero and Google Scholar and how they mesh, using Google Scholar as an example of a use of Zotero. And I'm going to use my own research to talk about that. A lot of librarians are researchers as well, and my particular area has to do with intercultural communication theory and its application to online support. So I've worked with some of UNB's offshore programs, and a big finding of mine was the importance of building strong relationships prior to the programs, whether it was virtually, but ideally in person, before establishing more of a working relationship. So here's my obligatory man holding a freshly caught fish picture, as Mike was suggesting, is a good idea for presentations. So this is me in Trinidad and Tobago, and just to give you a sense of the size of room that a librarian's research budget can accommodate for you there. So I'll be using my own particular research topic as an example of searching Google Scholar, and also my process in publishing a particular article about it in using Zotero. And why is that? Because Zotero is citation management software, one of many that are out there, some of which are for money, others are open access. Zotero is an open access one, and it is in fact the citation management software that UNB has decided to put some support behind in order to help students. And there's another one called Mendeley that we support as well. And people responsible for that just happen to be in this room today. So basically, Zotero is a number of intertwined things. It is a desktop application that you download. It is cloud storage that enables you to sync what you're doing in harvesting citations and documents across devices. And it is a browser plugin. So it appears in your browser interface, allows you to harvest citations, metadata, and PDFs where they exist in documents. And it's also a Microsoft Word plugin. So in working in Word, you have a Zotero library that you've built, and you can drop citations into your documents in whatever citation style you want, generate bibliographies from there. It sounds almost too good to be true. A lot of things that sound that way, there's always caveats, but if you're beginning a research project, if you're beginning your degree or a particular project and you don't have a system in place that will enable you to get away from having some citations in different database accounts, on thumb drives, on napkins, and all that sorts of thing. Zotero is one way to bring it all together. And it's also a community of practice at UNB where there's lots of people using it and can provide you some support when you want to do some interesting things or things just aren't working the way that you intend. Oh, I wouldn't say that. Tatiana at the back would definitely not say that either. And we do, as part of
it immediately, that's why.
yeah, and if you started with something and it works, great. There's nothing wrong with that.
So we'll
For sure.
learn it.
Yeah, exactly. Should say too that what happens after the boosters, these short sessions, is that where it makes sense, we also hold more in-depth sessions on particular topics of interest. And I'll be talking a little bit about that at the end. But anyways, you want to get some information on Zotero, a good place to start is the library website, lib.unb.ca. And if you scroll to the bottom of the page, you will see what I call the Scholar's Corner pocket. Z is for Zotero, it's at the bottom of the list. And this is a little bit even a sneak peek of future booster sessions, because these are very much our research intensive areas like copyright and GIS and open access, research data management, those sorts of things. So there's a link to a Zotero guide there. And what this does is take you through the process of setting Zotero up, both as the desktop application, as the browser connector plugin, and as the Microsoft connector plugin and the cloud storage. So step by step, there's 2 people on this guide, one of whom is here. Rochelle is at the back, who provides support as one of our librarians, and Aggie as well, another librarian, and they will actually be running some Zotero sessions later in October. And their contact information is there. Anyways, you can go through the steps of getting set up, understanding how to save citations, how to organize folders within your Zotero interface, how to output your bibliographies, whether standalone or in Microsoft Word. So that is always available to you if you're a DIYer. Sometimes it's just your device has its own quirks too, so the hands-on workshops can be useful in those cases. You're like, oh, why isn't this working? And Rochelle and Aggie have seen all the tricks in the book for all the eventualities that come up. Murphy's Law being what it is. So I'm going to talk about using Zotero from the Google Scholar vantage point. And I also wanted to do this because there is a worst best kept secret on campus. And I certainly see it as the librarian for education students who often send me queries saying there's this document I need and I can't get the full text. And I search on Google Scholar and it comes up like that. Why can't they get the full text? It's obvious it's there. It's because if you're not on campus, where you are funneled through a proxy server and authenticated or validated as a UNB person online, you have to tell Google Scholar that you're a UNB person anywhere off campus, so that the subscriptions that your tuition dollars and bursaries are paying for can be leveraged to your advantage, which is to say you have access to all the full text behind Google Scholar's sophisticated searching. So instead of just doing a search and you see a link, you click on it and it's inviting you to pay $30 for the article, you click on it and you just get your typical UNB login screen instead. So what you do there, if you've never done it before, and again, the things I'm talking about, I will put links in the description to the YouTube capture of this session so you can refer back to them. And I do have a video about this. You click on the 3 bars at the upper left of Google Scholar, you go to settings, and then you'll see a search box. If you're on campus, if you went to this, you'd see that University of New Brunswick was already checked because it's all managed behind the scenes, but otherwise you'd put in University of New Brunswick. Or if you're affiliated with another university at the same time and have access to their collections, you could add that one as well, because sometimes different universities subscribe to different collections. So it would be to your advantage. Search for UNB, click the checkbox and hit save. And then from there, you have access through Google Scholar searching to all of UNB's subscriptions. Ones that would be managed through Google Scholar or accessible anyways. All right, so a couple of things that I really like about Google Scholar that I'll talk about from the vantage point of my particular research, which had a lot to do with international students and understanding the international offshore student experience. A lot of that research happens in what are relatively, which is to say not 200-year-old academic journals. Maybe they're open source journals being published in the Caribbean or in Africa or somewhere in Asia or Eastern Europe or even Europe. There's a lot of sources that the traditional subscription databases, the PsycInfos, the Eriks if you're an education student, the CINAHLs, all sorts of them do not index because they just haven't added those sources. A lot of institutional repositories at different universities are publishing either, as with the case of UNB, their dissertations, PhD dissertations and theses, and they're only accessible through Google Scholar. They're no longer in ProQuest dissertations and theses. So a lot of international, a lot of open access, and a lot of graduate level work is only represented in Google Scholar. So say what you want about it. Often it's the only game in town for a lot of the sort of information you might be looking for, at least for my own purposes. It's something for you to decide for yourself. A couple of things I also like as well. It's not the only one that does this, but I really like how it works. You know, of course, you've found some information that you're interested in. You go to the bibliography and you can trace the particular arguments backwards in time. With Google Scholar, it's quite easy to trace those arguments forwards in time through the cited by. So this article, for example, was published in 2005. Google Scholar is aware it's been cited 118 times. You click on that and it takes you to those results. And then from there, you can do things like search within those results again, clicking on search within articles and drill down a little bit. So it's got some facility that works quite well, I find. So it's definitely worth exploring if you haven't. But really the meat of it is that you need to be able to know how to link off-campus subscriptions to Google Scholar. That really is the big thing to take away. And it's alarming to me how many students don't get turned on to that basic information. A couple of other things to bear in mind too, clicking on the related article links I find are kind of interesting. You don't always know what's going on with Google Scholar. The algorithm's proprietary. The coverage is somewhat opaque, but I do find that the related articles, what did Mike call it? It wasn't magical, it was automagical. Yeah, this has some automagical stuff going on that can be quite impressive. It looks like a bit of a gimmick, but it's definitely worth it. The other thing too, that's just a tip, is to try searching in whatever your browser's version of incognito mode is. If you know anything about the Google search bubble, it starts to learn your habits and send you things that you want. And I've even had students come to the desk and ask me, I'm looking for this article, and it was so buried in the results when I searched for it. It's not an area that I searched for at all. So Google doesn't really have a profile on me, and it came right up. So why is that? I don't really know, but the incognito mode is probably a good thing to try, even just to see how it affects your results on a similar search. And that's just a slide talking about Google Scholars. Mike was mentioning being able to develop your own profiles within it and consolidate your citations, have it look at what your citations counts are too. I can see that I peaked very early in life in 1999 and have never really reached those heights again, but that's okay. But I had to consolidate my name too across publications to make this work. Okay, so this is Google Chrome, the browser that I'm using here. In the upper right, you can see it's going to look different in different browsers and different versions of browsers. In this case, it looks like a little puzzle piece, but you'll have something with your plugins when you installed it. Then I've got my Zotero connector. So it appears in Google Scholar. It appears in UNB WorldCat, our catalog that searches out much of our journal collection, but particularly our monograph collections. It appears in the databases that you might be more familiar with, the EBSCO products, the ProQuest. It even works in Amazon. What it does when you click on that box is the results that are on that screen come up in this little box. You check the ones that you want to download into Zotero. And then you have to have Zotero open, but I'm not going to get into the mechanics of that. That's what the longer workshops are for. It comes into Zotero, and then from there you can do some nifty things. You can make notes at particular points as you're reading the document, keep track of those notes within Zotero. You can tag those notes with keywords, and then your tags start to appear, and then you can click on the tags and it consolidates all the items that you have identified with those. You can put them into different folders. Things can be in the same folder, in multiple folders, that is. And what I wanted to touch on here, and you can create bibliographies directly from that interface too. You don't have to do it within Word if you don't want to, in various citation styles. Cloud storage, so you're doing everything on the desktop, but then you can move it into the cloud and then transport it wherever you need. You can create groups across, kind of a little bit like what Mike was talking about. You can share your Zotero bibliographies or folders across different people who also have Zotero through the cloud storage. And then the plugin on MS Word, this is just a demonstration of what it looks like when you're in there. It enables you, as you're writing a paper, to access your Zotero bibliography, grab the citations you want, drop them into the paper, and then at the end you can generate within your paper. It grabs whatever you put in it, creates the bibliography. That sounds great. A challenge, however, is, and it's a big challenge and a persistent challenge, is that Zotero doesn't get great metadata from its sources. It gets dirty data. So you get things like citations that come in that are all caps, or that are missing information. A journal that it was able to harvest the volume but not the issue, or it wasn't able to get the date, whatever the case may be. So then you go at the end, you generate your bibliography, and then it's like you look at it and pull your hair and go, what do I do now? And that's really a big frustration for people in using something like Zotero. It was a huge frustration for me. I did the ultimate worst thing. I didn't do any of that, and I was publishing I thought I was going to publish in a journal that took APA at a time when APA wasn't demanding the pagination. And then it turned out that it was rejected by an APA journal. I sent it to a journal that ultimately published it in Chicago. It wanted the page numbers. I didn't have them consistently in my Zotero bibliography. So I had to reorder things in document delivery, go pull things off of shelves, and just go through and add those damn page numbers. And it took me probably a month, not because I was doing nothing but that, but I just didn't have time to really get to it. So beware, what you have to do as you're going along is check the metadata that's going in and then edit as you go if there's something that's not quite right. So it's an extra step. It slows things down a little bit, but it'll pay dividends at the other end. So that's always within your power. So Zotero is only as good as the data that comes into it and your oversight.
I'm having Zotero and Mendeley at the same time in Word example or another, because there is some of them, maybe they've got an asset. Vice versa. And if I install both of them, if there are as well opportunity, they example to take like take on my file already on my stuff article in Mendeley to transfer it easily to Zotero and vice versa. Is there a way?
Well, I defer to the Zotero versus Mendeley experts here. Have you had experience of people moving one set of resources from one to the other?
Simultaneously, I don't think.
You can put the two add-ins, you know, in the them. It is what I wanted to know.
Probably wouldn't want to choose both of them in the same paper.
Yeah. I know we can. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would assume it'd be interesting to try, but I've never installed both plugins in Word, but they shouldn't cross, I wouldn't think. Because I should probably hurry up, coming in, breaking into people's time. What else did I want to say? Those were probably the biggest thing. I will say that there's different, because it's an open platform, there is the ability for other companies and people who have the knack to develop plugins for Zotero. So I used a plugin that enabled the generation of annotated bibliography. So it pulled the abstracts along with the citations. And then I ran something called Voyant that Julie and Erik are going to be talking to do a little bit of text analysis around the data that I was finding. So this had to do with this was really interesting to me. This is another project that I'm working on to do with newcomers in New Brunswick schools and articles that we found about that. And it was interesting that indispensability was the most common word coming up in that set, which I hadn't even clued into as a recurring theme, at least in the data, or at least coming up with that word. And then there's collocations that happen. Very interesting things that my colleagues are going to take a look at. And I'll just mention that there are a couple of Zotero sessions coming up soon, and there may be Mendeley as well. I haven't spoken with Tatiana yet about that. And it will be carried in, as I said, the description of the video capture for this session. Thank you. Julie Morris, our number cruncher extraordinaire with a commitment to excellence. And Erik, tell me more, a defiant bon vivant and great storyteller in a profession that sometimes resists it.
Comes from being a
Take it away.
All right, so I'm Julie Morris. I'm the Collections Analysis and Bibliometrics Librarian. This is my colleague Erik, who is English Anthropology and Classics Liaison Librarian. For the sake of time, I'm just going to move forward to our first slide, which is what is text and data mining, or text data mining, which is why you're also here. So for context, there's about 1.5 million scholarly articles that are published every year. It's a very overwhelming amount of of data. So text data mining can help you parse through it and, look for innovative, to innovate with it and explore it, because it's a lot of information. It can be overwhelming. With the increase of digitized and digital materials that are becoming available, TDM is actually growing is a growing research area, especially in the arts and humanities. So is there anyone here in arts and humanities? No. Okay. I mean, it's also used in other fields, and we'll talk about that later on. Yeah, text data mining is interdisciplinary in nature. It draws from linguistics, computer science, statistics, and library science, which is very interesting to us. And it uses tools to retrieve and extract information and meaning from a corpus of texts. Basically, what it does is it uses natural language processing to read digital texts. TDM can be used to help extract new information and new knowledge from a corpus of texts, and to find thematic patterns and trends, and to enable the systematic review of literature. So for example, you could use text data mining to look for trends in a set of articles, as Marc did. So it might be something you're researching and you want to look for a new research area. You could use TDM to do that. It uses Python, Julia, and R coding, but you don't have to be a programmer to do it. There are lots of tools that don't require programming languages, and Erik and I will talk about those. Really quickly, first you're going to build your data set. That's a tricky one. You can build your own data set either using Zotero, or we have databases here at the library that you can use, or you can use something you find on the internet, but there are copyright considerations you need to take into account. Then you want to pre-process your data, which is basically just cleaning it, organizing it, making sure it's consistent. And then you can go ahead and analyze your data. So I'm going to pass it over to Erik, and Erik's going to talk about a product or a tool that we have here at the library.
Yeah, I'll be looking at one of our, I'll just show you a really quick glimpse. This is the barest thing on Gale Digital Scholar Lab. And I'm using an example out of history, looking at women's suffrage traced over 7 decades, starting in 1860. But seriously, this can be applied to transcriptions of field work, or all kinds of any corpus of text you can think of, you could bring text analysis to. So here you come to Gale Digital Scholar Lab, and as Julie said, there are 3 steps: build, pre-process, in this case clean, and analyze. And if you come into the build section of, I'm just going to say GDSL, of GDSL, you'll see there's 2 ways to start building. You can either upload your own documents. I'm not going to do that right now. She'll talk about an example where she's got some external documents. Or you can search Gale resources, and that's already copyright cleared for you. So we've got 15 databases included in this that you can be using independently for research. You know, you're looking up British newspaper articles, or you can use it to as the basis for being able to grab lots and lots of text to run some analyses on. So the user interface would look something like this. You're very familiar with this kind of searching by now, right? So let's just say I start my search, and there's some wildcards, etc. Looking for women in suffrage, and I scroll down and I give it a bunch of parameters. I say, look, of these 15 things that we have access to in our Gale suite, which, by the way, that's millions and millions of pages of content. I just want these 2: British Library newspapers, Times Digital Archive. I tell it some filters over there. Look, just these kinds of publication sections, this geographic coverage, these dates. The publication sections, I mean, I'm being very careful to say, look, I don't want women's suffrage in advertising or art and sport and that kind of thing. And then you can give it to a limit on, I only want optical character recognition that has done a pretty good job. So things that the algorithm feels like that's a safe bet that I'm giving you good answers. Document types are myriad. There's like 160 of them. I found the best one was circus review. I did not look for women's suffrage in circus reviews. I just liked that it was there. Here's that whole query I constructed, and I've run my search. I get 10,300 results. That's really cool because the cap for a set is 10,000, so I haven't gone too much over. So I can drill down and look at each one of those results if I want and see a digital facsimile of the newspaper itself. or the OCR over to the right that's actually being searched by the system. And then this is just a nice analysis of, here's how many documents, which authors, where they came from, etc. Now I go into clean. I know we said that it's steps 1, 2, and 3. It's really 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, because you just keep iteratively cleaning and reanalyzing. It can be a long, tedious process, but it's the work you have to put in. GDSL will give you this default set of stop words, thinking that, oh, you probably don't want to analyze a and after and all and although and all those kinds of things, right? You can take that if you want and run with it. What you probably want to do is run that once, get a good analysis, and then come back and start adding things that you saw that does also cruft. So for instance, I run this, I say, look, I'm going to do the term frequency under n-grams. In this case, I'm just going to treat n-grams as one-word units, and there's a longer discussion there, but as Marc says, that can be for longer workshops. I run it once for the top 100 n-grams in this 10,000 document, millions of word set. Women, not surprisingly, is number 1. But there's all this stuff I don't want, abbreviations, punctuation marks, and so forth. So I think, oh, okay, right, best practice is to do this kind of thing, setting a few rules, saying, get rid of special characters, punctuation, lowercase, everything. So I do that, I run again. I say, oh, look, I'm still getting abbreviations, the letter J, the numeral 1, there's cruft. So here's where it gets slow and fun and tedious. I download this to, say, I open it in Excel as a common delimited format, and I open up a text editor and I just start putting in all the cruft. Here are things that I know I'm going to want to add to the stop list, and this takes quite a while, but it's really worth it. And you can see there's abbreviations, single letters, ing, where like a line is broken, work hyphen, next line is ing, it treats that as an n-gram. Little UTF-8 hiccups, like right there, that thing, 2,500 times in this set. So I don't want that to get analyzed. Take some time getting all this right, and I go and I append it back into my stop word list, and I run this again, and lo and behold, much, much better, cleaner set to run with. So that would be just a typical n-gram count. I can also do everyone's favorite, the word cloud, so that frequency is shown by color and rank is shown by size of text. And I can run things like sentiment analysis. So Gale Digital Scholar has 6 different categories of analysis tools, and each category has 1 or 2, sometimes 3 actual tools. This is sentiment analysis. This is running algorithms that say, look, are the words in this set favorable or unfavorable in general to whatever is being discussed? This looks like good journalism to me over 70 years. I mean, most of it is smack in the middle, neutral, some negative, some positive, but very little on the extremes. What you might expect. You can also run sentiment analysis over time. So here's my whole timeline, and it dips down very low for some reason just before World War I. I think it was because actually women's suffrage was just about to become universally accepted, and it was like a last-ditch effort by a bunch of cranky white men to say, we don't like those. So yeah, that's over time. You can then click on a year like 1914 and have a look at individual articles and see, oh, obstinate suffragette, which, Flora Drummond would have worn that as a badge of pride. So this is just a quick look at what GDSL can do. And now over to Julie to talk about Voyant.
Erik?
In Canada.
Yes, Canadian platform. So Voyant is a free and open tool that you can use. We love free and open here at the library, so you can connect with any of us and we will happily try to get you with a free and open tool. So what I did for Voyant, I decided to analyze some UNB content that came from our archives. So this is actually available on our website. You can access it. It's a diary that was written by Benjamin Marston, who's a loyalist from Massachusetts, who kind of lost everything during the American Revolution and came to Nova Scotia first and then to New Brunswick and kept this diary about his travels and his life from 1776 to 1787. So this is Voyant. What you can do is if your data is available online, you can pull the URL, paste it into Voyant, and it'll run analysis for you. Or you can upload your own data sets. So if you have it in like a PDF, CSV file, Marc mentioned that there's a plugin for Zotero. I was blanking. Yeah, so there are lots of ways to get the data you want. And then you run some analysis, and this is what the dashboard looks like. I then went in and edited, you can edit the stop word list. You can preload a stop word list, and it has many different languages. So you're not just limited to English here. If you're analyzing data from a different language, and then you can add stop words. The other thing you can do is build categories based on positive or negative sentiment. So similar to what Erik was showing with sentiment analysis, you can build out those lists. Voyant is going to recognize a lot of words and categorize them automatically for you, but you can edit it. So I cleaned up my data set very quickly and then ran it again. And this is what the dashboard looks like. So you can see some of the big words are years, and you see the word wind is really big there. And that might be important to Benjamin Marston's story. You can actually change all those visualizations and customize your dashboard however you like. There's a bunch of tools that you can load instead, the ones that you saw there. So I'm going to go through some of my favorite ones. The first one is geographical representation. So Benjamin Marston's story starts in America and leads him to Canada, but he also traveled to Europe and other places. And Voyant will pick up those geographical terms and visualize them on a map for you. So if you're in history and you're looking at the trajectory that people have taken, this is really great. The other thing I want to show is document terms. And what it does is it just counts how many times a word appears in the corpora of text. So for example, the word ship appears 1,745 times, indicating that naval travel is important to the Marston Diary. And then it gives you spark lines there, just showing the, the over time when it appears in the text. Next is collocating terms, which I think is really interesting. So it tells you how many times words appear together in the text. So for example, there's like good and soup that appears twice, or good and inheritance. So if you're looking at a topic like inheritance in the Marston papers, you might want to see what other kinds of terms appear alongside that word. And finally, there's topic modeling, which what Voyant does is it pulls words that appear in clusters and assumes that they're related to each other. So one example would be the words cold, long, and 1780. We can infer that maybe that's a cold, long year. And that's Voyant in a nutshell. If you have any more questions, just reach out and we're happy to help you with it.
I'm just going to blast through this last bit because I know that we're running a little bit over. So just text and data mining tools. We've got the flagships that we're using right now are Gale Digital Scholar Labs and Ithaca's Constellate, which ties into JSTOR. So if you use JSTOR for much research, this really does let you do very, very large data analysis on JSTOR material, which is huge. And Voyant, the open source one that she was just showing. You may be aware of Google's Ngram Viewer that lets you plumb all of Google Books. And then OpenRefine is just a powerful open cleaning tool. And I haven't used it much, but Julie is working on getting to know it better. So if you need help with that, you can talk to her. There are also tools that are specifically for medical subject headings. I'm just going to let you see that and move on because we are out of time. Copyright considerations. If you saw the promo video for this workshop, you saw me say something glib like, a corpus can be things like all the novels of Margaret Atwood. Well, yeah, but you'd have to have permission to use that. So I probably should have picked a different version. There are plenty of times that you might want to use IP protected materials, and that'd be allowed through a product like Gale Digital Scholar, where they're already using Gale sources. But when you have any questions, we've got a copyright team led by Josh Dickinson, and we can help get you sorted. And then just as with Zotero, there's a guide, a research guide for text and data mining. It's got copyright information, and just you can see the tabs there. It's also got Julie and my contact information. I think that is all we've got.
Really a big part of what the boosters intended to do is to connect people who have some common interest in what they're doing. And also bear in mind that you're all big brain people who can figure a lot of this out for yourself, but you have a lot of other concerns and things you're doing. And so please feel free to call upon us to give you that leg up so that a lot of that work, like Gale Constellate, involves programming and Python and whatnot. And if you don't want to learn programming in Python in your spare time, for example, then call on us to give you a little bit of a hand. So this concludes our first booster. Look for more sessions of this nature and other things that are coming up that you'll be made aware of in the same channels that you found out about Booster. And everyone who registered for this session will receive a follow-up email within the next week with the YouTube link, and with it, as I keep saying, links to how you can learn more, where you can learn more about the things that we've spoken about today. So thanks very much and have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you around.
Thank you, everyone.
So much.